Welcome everybody to today's MPC seminar. My name is Tobias Grohmann and I'm a research fellow at the MPC. I welcome everyone here in person as well as online. Please let us know online if you have any difficulties hearing us or any other technical issues. We will try to take care of it. Today's presenter is Carlota Minnella. She's also a research fellow at MPC, and she will present her paper entitled Policy Elites Theories of Migration, which she co-authored with Siegfried Mannschein and Martin Roos, also of EUI. I think I saw the setup or the theoretical part of the study last year at the MPC Global Sit conference, and now I'm happy and excited to hear or to learn more about the results of the study. Carlota will present for about 25 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A until the top of the hour. So please, Carlota, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me fine? Okay. And so as my chair said, this piece is co-authored with Siegfried Mannschein and Martin Roos. And just to, okay, again, what? Just as a preface, this is part of a broader research project that's called Dynamic. Dynamic is a 3-year Horizon 2022 project run by a consortium of research institutions across Africa and Europe. So this research normally focuses on theories of migration decision-making, so looking at the heterogeneity of decisions on the part of the migrants. But there is a component of this study that actually focuses on the policy side, and so trying to understand what the people that actually contribute to making migration regulations and implementing these regulations know about why migration happens. And this is a gist, is what you're going to hear about today. So I should preface what I'm saying by telling you that I know you're excited about the results, and our results basically stopped the data collection about the 3rd of February of this year. So they're still preliminary results, and I will sort of outline where we see the direction of the results going, but we are not, we haven't closed the data collection for this project yet. So why we thought there was need for this study? As you know, there is a very rich and detailed literature about why people migrate from macro, meso, but also individual perspectives. And there are a certain number of qualitative pieces, including several from members that are currently at the MPC or were affiliated with the MPC in the past, that try to understand from a qualitative and also comparative perspective what the decision-making process looks like in migration governance, but also what actors that participate in this process think about migrations and the reasons why individuals migrate. However, there is no systematic comparative quantitative studies that actually tries to map this particular dynamics and actually try to see what people think about the drivers of migration. So we focus on Europe-Africa cooperation on migration for several reasons. It is one of the focuses of the project in terms of studying migration decision-making. This is one of the most salient and perhaps divisive at present issues in the debates in Europe concerning migration. And we know that the governance of migration is highly politicized, and the cooperation within EU countries and between EU countries and non-EU countries is perceived as increasingly important, but also perhaps problematic. So EU-Africa cooperation has made a lot of progress over the years, but is still defined by some people as having limited results. And there are several explanations for this sort of patchy network of agreements that has been developed. Some refer to divergent interest, which surely are part of the process. Some refer to different structural and institutional contexts. There are also different policy preferences on the part of public opinion in different EU member states across the European Union, but also different attitudes on the part of European elites. But we asked the question, what if part of the reasons why cooperation has not progressed so far is also because policy actors in Europe and in Africa fundamentally think about the migration phenomenon differently, but also the implications of this thinking differently. What kind of impact could that have on policymaking? So as a result, we asked two questions of this research. The first one, which is more policy orientated, how do policy actors in Europe and in Africa understand and think about the reasons why individuals decide to migrate? And then this is the more theoretical sort of rendering of the questions. And here you're talking with a political scientist, mostly an international relation theorist that does foreign policy analysis. So sorry for the overload of theory. How are policy actors' understandings of the reasons why individuals migrate related and shaped by what we call their situational context? So for those of you familiar with political science, especially, let's say, constructivist approaches, the situational context relates to what sometimes the theory call social environments. So the series of basically the places where you act in your normal lives that influence your identity or multiple identities. And I will go into this in a second. And as you see, we consider three macro variables that we think have an impact on basically the thinking, the way actors think about the phenomenon of migration. So in a nutshell, our argument is the following, that policy actors' knowledge claims about the determinant of migrations depend on their positionality or social context. So I should say, first of all, that by knowledge claim, it's a way of being, it's a fancy way in a sense of saying understandings or of saying thoughts or opinions, but specifically a knowledge claim, according to Goffman's definition, is a narrative or a representation of facts that's based both on information and beliefs and the values of the individual. So there is a part of it that's objective, if you want, but there is a part of it that's ideational, it's driven by identity. And we define positionality, or we draw from this definition by migrant et al. Positionality refers to the fact that peoples are not defined in terms of fixed identities, but by their location within shifting networks of relationships. So for the sake of this theory, we identify three macro networks, if you want, or three macro contexts. Where the actor is located, which we consider to be not just related to their geographical location, so related, for example, to elements linked to the national interest of that the actor represent, but also their ideational affiliation and ideational basically attachment, which organization they represent. So referring to, for example, contribution that study how the culture of a specific organization can influence the identity of the actor, can socialize them into certain practices, values, or standard operating procedures that may have an impact on the way they see a particular issue and also how they act, referring to that particular issue. And the third one is who the actor are. So specifically, we differentiate between bureaucrats or civil servants and elected officials, thinking that, according to the literature again, they respond to different incentive systems, and they respond to different, also to the effects of the first two variables in different ways. And so basically, we claim that the social context, as we theorize it, can have an impact on the way elites frame the problem of migration. So on the basis of this, we derive three expectations. So the figure is, I guess, easier to understand than the expectation, but policy actors' knowledge claims about migration drivers are influenced by their diagnostic migration issue frame. So they're not influenced by how they see the problem of migration, how they interpret the problem of migration or migration as a problem. Migration governance actors' diagnostic issue frames vary according to their positionality, so the three sort of the social context that I sketched before. And then policy actors' knowledge claims about migration drivers vary according to their positionality, but mediated through their frames. So we posit basically that knowledge claims come about by and large through mediated effect, but we also left room to test for the presence of direct effects. So the fact that the social context could influence directly the way individuals think about the problem, migration as an issue, so diagnose the migration as an issue. I've been using the word frame a lot. And so just to go back to the definition of frame, this is something that in migration literature is mentioned a lot, especially in qualitative studies. So frames, according to Goffman, again, are schemata of interpretation to organize information in an agentic and processual way. And at the same time, they, according to Snow and Benson's analysis, they serve three different functions. They serve a diagnostic function, so you extract diagnostic cues relating to a specific issue, a specific problem, a specific phenomenon. And this is what we are interested in, so the diagnostic function of the frame. But you can also then make prognostic assumptions about how to solve these specific issues. And this part of the study of frames in migration studies, generally speaking, is perhaps the most widespread one, the ones that sort of link thinking about migration in a certain way to a specific policy output. And then the third sort of function of frames relates to the motivational, so the actor mobilization part, which is perhaps the one that's cited or perhaps more prominent in the media when, for example, you study the discourse in the media looking at how migration is framed, and it's used as a sort of performative kind of function to elicit a kind of mobilizational response into a target population. But we're interested in the cognitive function and specifically in how this thinking about the problem of migration, making sense of it, is linked to how actors then think about the driver. So what actually causes migration? So before we jump into how we did this and what we found, we identified two different types of overarching dimensions related to frames. This was based on a very extensive review of the literature that look at the different type of framing exercises that are conducted when talking about migration. So one is thematic, so relative to a specific issue area. And here we could have included others. So if you want, we can debate why we selected this, but those were the most prominent ones in the literature. So the economic and development dimension, individual protection, and security. And then we refer to the group of reference of basically the making sense of migration related to migrants, basically origin countries that can also be transit, and destination country that can also be transit countries. So just very briefly, I will okay. Thank you. Okay. So basically, I'll just outline the hypothesis very briefly for you. There are 22 hypotheses in our pre-analysis plan, and if you would like to see them all, I have an appendix at the end of the slides. So this is just to show what the hypothesis could look like in terms of, for example, hypothesis 1 to 9 was interested in the effects of the actor's positionality. So there's 3 levels that determine the, let's say, identity of the actor on their frames. So for example, if you look at W1, which we identified at the location for like proxy for location and also ideational attachment, we assume that, for example, actors located in Africa would be more likely to have an origin focus or a migrant focus frame rather than actors located in Europe. Okay, no, it's okay. And then continuing on the specific section of the hypothesis, for example, if you look at the organizational culture component, we hypothesize that actors that, for example, works for interior department, depending on whether they are, for example, in charge of the protection portfolio rather than the simple security or deterrence portfolio, would be more likely to have a protection or security frame rather than actors, for example, working in foreign affairs or development or labor ministries. As regards the second set of hypotheses, we look at how a policy actor's dominant diagnostic frames might affect how they think about the drivers of migration. So what causes migration? And we identified 7 dimensions that relate to origin, journey, and destination characteristics. I will show them to you in a second when we move on to the data collection. So for example, we hypothesize that respondents with an economics and development frame will believe potential migrants to be more responsive to economic changes and incentives. And so they might think that a change in the situation in the country of origin, economic situation, could actually be the reasons why a migration scenario is more attractive. So how did we go about and collect data for this? We design dual survey. So it's an experimental survey, a conjoint experiment, and a standard survey. that we fielded to decision makers in Europe and Africa that are involved with the governance of migration at every level. So from bureaucratic support, let's say, mechanism to some decision makers that actually work at the level of political actors to the implementation phase. So we actually try to cover as much as possible of the different stages. And we fielded the survey. We opened it in October 2024. It's still ongoing. We are almost we have almost reached our sort of goal in terms of sample size. And what we ask the actors to do, I think I can just show you and then come back, is assess the attractiveness of given migration scenarios. So we I built an hypothetical country, African country, that would be the average of for countries that we're actually studying more directly. So we are focusing on Tunisia, Morocco, Kenya, and Nigeria for several reasons that I can expand upon if you want in the Q&A. So we extracted data from this and sort of developed the profile of this hypothetical African country. And then we ask actors from Africa and Europe to have a look at the scenario and think about, have a look at the scenario and think about which of the different combination would be considered more attractive in order for them to migrate from Africa to Europe. I don't know how many, I suppose everybody who is from the MPC is familiar with a conjoint experiment. Is anybody not familiar with a conjoint experiment? Okay, then I will just skip the part where I explain what a conjoint experiment is, but just to say that we also supplemented this data collection, which is experimental, with a standard questionnaire. And the standard questionnaire in particular allows us to actually map the frames, so the diagnostic frames of the respondents. Specifically, we differentiated between migrant, European origin country, and destination country, African origin country, but we also randomized the order in which these three were presented, and also the position of the specific table within the survey. So it came either before or after, and if it came before, it was separated by 6 questions from the conjoint experiment so that it would not prime respondents. We also included an attention check. So let's move on to the results for the next about 9 minutes. As I said, those are the results of the 3rd of February, and the collection is still ongoing. We are slightly underpowered still, but we are pretty much getting there. As of February the 3rd, we had 254 respondents across Africa and Europe. We had a very high number of partial completes, about 700. So whom did we sample? So our elites, as I said, policy actors that were located in the European Union across, for example, all the different DGs and agencies that are involved with migration. In certain cases, our survey was spread through a snowballing sampling technique. So we identified gatekeepers that we consider having certain authority to, for example, spread the survey or help us spread the survey among those colleagues, and also identify who the people are, because of course we only sent it to people that actually work on migration and occupy the migration portfolio. DG Home, for example, kindly accepted to spread the survey centrally for us. They also sent it to the European migration networks, representatives in the 28 member states, and also at the European Asylum Agency, where we also helped by some of our colleagues. The same for Africa. So we were helped by somebody in the labor basically division of the African Union, and representatives and members, and also members of parliament, but also specifically civil servants within different ministries and relevant ministries across the African countries we're interested in, not just those actually, but and also several European member states. So as you can see, the majority are female, though there is a slight difference between female and well, between Africa and Europe in the sample. Generally speaking, I mean, what you can draw from this sample is that they're not very different. In a sense, there aren't huge differences in terms of the age, in terms of the education. Majority are postgraduates. There's a certain prevalence maybe of African respondents that only hold a bachelor's degree. I think it was 22%. But by and far, the samples are similar. So there are no big differences between African respondents and European respondents. The one thing to note is that for the time being, we are not able to say anything about difference about who, so the third W that we identify, so elected and unelected officials, because as we see, we only have 2.4% respondents from elected officials. Specifically, our colleagues at the Institute for the World Economy in Kiel, they sent, I think, emails to the survey to all the representatives in the German parliament. I personally wrote to probably all the representatives at the European Parliament. So we tried to spread the survey as much as possible, but I mean, there were some difficulties that are linked to conducting survey among elites, and this is also why we are sort of pooling the sample, although we are also trying to conduct some subgroup analysis. So those are the results of the standard questionnaire. And they go in the direction that we expect. You have, in this case, and I would like to point out, there are factors that at the origin country level seem to have an impact. And maybe what is interesting is that ODA in this specific case seem to have no impact, and liberal agreements, there is no agreement about liberal agreement, whether they increase the likelihood of migrating or they don't. I think what is more interesting, however, are the results of the conjoint experiment. So those are the average marginal component effects without the subgroup analysis. So taking the whole sample. Set up professional auto setting. Oh, let's see. Oh, okay. That was easy, actually. Right. So basically, again, from this particular table, what we see interestingly is that origin country characteristics don't seem to be considered relevant, so they don't seem to have an effect. Again, we are slightly underpowered, so it might be, yeah?
So I can ask something just for clarification.
Yeah.
So you were asking the perceived attractiveness of migration to Europe. Can you say a bit more about this? How was this question exactly framed?
So the question was framed by asking, I think I can actually, I have a. In your view, under which of these two migration scenarios would a citizen of the African country described above prefer to migrate to Europe? And then we asked them to rank, so which scenario was considered to be more attractive. And obviously one of the dimensions would vary randomly across the two scenarios. So very briefly, because we don't have much time, but as you see, the origin country characteristics don't seem to be considered important in this specific case. The effects are as expected, but what is very interesting and what it perhaps stands out are the perception of the effects related to the cost of the journey, the ones related to the presence of legal residence status, and also the expected monthly income once at destination in Europe. In this specific dimension, and I can go back to it in the Q&A, we can also we also included benefits, which I will explain in a sense why we decided not to add an additional dimension. Then we also conducted analysis about the frames. I will not go into details. If you want, we can go back to it later, how we sort of characterize the frame to determine whether officials had held a specific frames or not. And so if you recall that table, what we asked officials to think about was how important they thought that these different characteristics should be in the governance of migration between Africa and Europe. And then we told them, for example, human rights of migrants, for example, the economic development in the family, security conditions, and so on and so forth. So this was coded in two different ways, but by and large, what we find, it seems that migrant frame with a focus on human rights is the one that's most widespread. We received questions also presenting this to sort of audience policy actors that asked us, are you sure? And it might be desirability bias on our part, although we did sort of do all the checks that we could, followed by economic effects and family effects. But by and large, the migrant frames seem to be the most important ones in terms of reference group frames, followed by origin country, and then only then destination countries. Then in terms of how frames correlate with the positionality, so the first part of our pathway to basically knowledge claims. What is interesting here again, and I think it refers also to the fact that we didn't find big differences between the samples like African respondents and European respondents, is that African respondents don't seem to be more likely to hold a migrant frame or an origin frame. And at the same time, there's no support for the hypothesis that European policy actors hold a destination frame. So in a sense, it might be that they think alike in terms of what the priorities are. And again, it seems even here that organizational cultures and what we call W2, so the organization they work for, so whose organization we're talking about, which organization we're talking about matters in terms of actually shaping their way of thinking about migration. And then lastly, we see here the relationships to the mediated effect, diagnostic frames, and how they actually have an effect on knowledge claims. So we had 11 hypotheses about this. And when we conducted the analysis, we were still too underpowered. So as you can see, all the confidence intervals are overlapping. So, but there is one that's actually interesting. So in the figure on the left-hand side, yes. So the lines in blue and the lines in red. So for the lines in blue, you have holders of a protection frame, and they, if legal resident status is present, holders of a protection frame are more likely to consider that specific migration scenario attractive than people with any other type of frame. It might be that once we have more results, other differences will emerge in terms of diagnostic frames and knowledge claims. And the last effect that we analyzed were direct effects between the three macro variables that I mentioned, so the positionality and the basically the knowledge claims. So here, all of them overlap. So this is a distinction between African sort of respondents and European respondents. However, again, as our sample size increases, it might be, and we think there is a good reason to think, that the economic cost of the journey and also the rate of completion might actually display different responses and effects on the part of European and African actors. Again, it seems that they're more important, so variation for European actors than they are for African actors that tend to consider all of this sort of non-consequential in terms of affecting the attractiveness of a given migration scenario. So to conclude, this is just some highlights on differences between African and European policy actors. So higher cost of the journey, lower completion rates do not reduce the attractiveness of migration scenario for African policy actors. An increase in ODA based on the standard questionnaire, however, leads to a reduction in the likelihood of migration from Africa to Europe, according to African respondents, but it has no effect according to European respondents. And again, higher availability of information about journey risk, which is a very important concern for European actors apparently at the moment, has no impact on the likelihood of migrating, according to 69% of European respondents, but African respondents do not seem to agree as much. So what we're doing with this, as I said, the survey is still open, and what we conclude is that even if the results are preliminary, the situational context does matter because it seems to have an impact on the way they think. And for the first time, we could sort of quantitatively assess and capture the existence of frames related to migration in policy actors that participate in the decision-making about migration, but also have some sort of preliminary evidence that this frame do seem to matter when actors make sense of migration as a phenomenon. In terms of what happens afterwards, somebody might want to mute themselves. I don't know. Could you mute yourself? Hear me? Now that's us. Have you gone all the way up and down? Oh, shit.
No, something happened.
Is that Zoom?
To operate this device.
Yeah. No, it's Zoom. It should be Zoom. You should go to Zoom. I think it's here. Oh gosh, Valentina, sorry. Well, I conclude, I run to the conclusion anyways. So there are some exciting steps that we want to conduct further, apart from actually sort of reaching the number we need in order to have statistically significant effects across the board. We will run, and this is going to run shortly, a pair conjoint experiment. So the same conjoint that we ran with policy actors, we're running with African migrants in the 4 different countries that I mentioned, so Tunisia, Morocco, Kenya, and Nigeria. And this will be conducted in the spring of 2025. We have some idea of the direction that the gap could go in terms, but it would be interesting to determine whether actually policy actors and migrants or prospective migrants actually think alike. And then we will also run the conjoint with academics that work in migration to try and see if their understanding of the drivers of migration, their approach to thinking and framing migration is similar to policy actors or even to migrants. And in a, let's say, third step of this research, we are actually mapping the presence of these understandings or absence of this understanding in actual policy documents that have been developed by the European Union, European member states, African countries, and African regional organizations to see if actually there is any correspondence between the way, so the cognitive dimension of how people that work on migration governance think and the actual documents that get produced. And if there isn't, trying to understand why. So I'll stop here. I have some additional sort of tables and a list of hypotheses in the appendix, but thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to your questions and feedback also.
Thank you, Carlota, for the presentation. We will now open the floor for questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, also online. We will start with questions from the room. We will take one by one. It's easier to handle. For those who are online, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question when I appoint you, or you can type your question in the chat and I will read it out. Thank you. From the room, are there any questions? You please. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. Really interesting line of research. I'm going to actually ask something that's sort of perhaps an adjacent study area. And I'm curious whether you have looked at or you will be expanding to look at the reverse causality from the direction that you've articulated in terms of the causality between beliefs, frames, and the policies that are created. You framed at you stated at the end of your talk that you want to look at whether different sets of beliefs, knowledge frames, or diagnostic frames might influence how laws and policies are designed. I'm curious whether how the legal or the policy regime in which an actor exists could influence one of their frames, their knowledge frame, or their diagnostic frame. So, you know, if they're operating within a more liberal migration regime, they have a different belief set that's in some ways a construct of their legal and regulatory environment, or maybe just as another causal input. It could be interesting.
Thank you. So for this specific project, we have not planned to do that, although so for this part, let's say, of the data collection that refers to the survey specifically, we do not look at, let's say, feedback loop effects, I guess, in socialization. That's, we sort of, I think we just build it in a sense from the person to the policy, but not the policy, vice versa. However, for the second part of this analysis where we look at the document specifically, and so we'll be using large text analysis of natural machine learning. We haven't decided yet, but one of the two. If we see there is a match or a mismatch, what we're interested would be trying to track why. And so we will be trying to focus on probably one case per country specifically, and try to track the specific, maybe process trace, the specific mechanism, events, but also belief background that allowed that specific decision to be made. Now, we thought initially about including, for example, questions on beliefs, so ideological beliefs, worldview, or even political sort of beliefs, conservative, liberal. It would have been very interesting to us, but we could not, or we were advised against, because it would have made the survey a bit perhaps more difficult to field, and as such we already had a lot of difficulties in terms of fielding survey. On a side note, I work on sort of elites and with elite surveys, and I have conducted research that looks at socialization both ways, but in completely different issue areas. But this is very interesting to think about whether, and I mean, it did come up, we started doing the interviews, and it did come up that even within certain, let's say, institutions at regional level, there are some offices that are traditionally considered liberal, offices are considered traditionally conservative, and that has an impact on the way they try to push the policies. But then ultimately, there is also a divide between the sort of bureaucratic layer and the policymaking decision layer, which unfortunately with these numbers, we cannot explore right now. And so this is why we are also trying to maybe make up for this absence of participants from the policy making word proper with interviews. So this is something we think about considering, but we haven't done it in the survey because it was already difficult to include more dimensions, and yeah, thinking about how big the sample was not going to be.
I just should have introduced myself. I'm Jillian Lester. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School, and I'm visiting up at the law program.
Thank you. Are you happy with the answer that you got?
Yes.
Perfect. Then we move to the next question. We have two more here in the room, and then we have, I think I saw at least two from online.
Thank you. I was wondering about the input you gave. No, for example, 500 or 5,000 or 10,000. How do you come to what's the base of all that? And the other thing is, did you have open questions in the question, or is it only 1 to 5? Because it's 1 to 5, it's always very difficult, the impact measuring. Yeah. So, and what did you say about knowledge formation sources? Well, that's the 4 things you mentioned: academic course, expert, and so on. Or did I understand that not so well?
Okay, thank you for the questions. So how do we come up with the numbers? Let's see if I can go back. Oh, yeah. Nope. Here. So we actually came up with the numbers looking both at contributions in the literature. It was mostly behavioral economics literature that tried to sort of map theories of decision making in migrants, and that used these numbers, but also looking at literature, so reports, for example, from IOM or the World Bank, or other studies that, for example, look at the risk of death en route across the 3 Mediterranean routes, and then we sort of average it out. And the same with monthly income in the European country. Again, certain of these dynamics we had, dimensions we had to combine. So, for example, monthly income, to us, it also includes sort of welfare benefits. So, for example, in the actual survey where we asked just simple questions, it was not the experimental survey, we did ask the question specifically about welfare benefits because it's very salient in the political debate in Europe. But in this particular case, we couldn't, again, because the sample size was small and we already had a lot of tasks. We actually asked to repeat this game 8 times, which some policy actors then came back to us telling us, we felt, you were testing us, or maybe we got tricked, or some were literally holding their hand when they were taking the survey. The same with, I should say, legal residents, because we do not differentiate between, let's say, labor migration and irregular migration, or protection specifically. And so we use the term legal reference because that subsumes both, leaving the actors open to make their own assumptions based on where they sit, basically, whether they work on. So we tested this with diplomats and then people from the labor ministry, and the diplomats went immediately to think about protection, and the labor ministry people immediately thought about labor agreements. So did we have open questions? We did have a few questions that tried to test the compositional effects. So if there was any compositional effect on the perception of migration between Africa and Europe, because this is interesting for us, because when we will run the survey with the migrants, we want to know whether we see the differences because they're thinking about a different kind of sample of potential migrants, or because actually there are different reasons that are not related to the composition of the sample. So we ask questions about whom they think was coming in terms of percentages between male and female, why they thought they were coming, and then also to explain, so give us some reasons why they thought individuals would be more likely to come to Europe rather than choosing another African destination country. We also asked them a question about gender. So we gave them the possibility in the standard survey questionnaire to answer it depends on. So rather than say it's more or less, or more likely, less likely, it depends on, and then to explain if they wanted us to let us know. So the last question, knowledge formation sources. Yeah, so this is, it was very important to us because there is a whole branch of migration studies literature that looks at the knowledge sort of policy gap. So the fact that a policy, sometimes there's a lot of evidence, but then it seems that the policy doesn't follow the evidence. And also in order to test the dynamics of socialization, basically, of the actors that we were investigating, we wanted to know where they got their information. The ones I listed, which I think it was, let me just see. Empirical approach. Oh, here. Sources of information, yes. We also included, for example, social media, intelligence reports, and so on and so forth. But those are the ones that sort of came on top with the difference, specifically that policy documents seem to be more reliable in the eyes of African counterparts, and in the eyes of the European stakeholders, expert knowledge was considered to be more important. We also had a certain number of experts because we asked individuals, basically respondents, to identify themselves as much as possible in order to obviously preserve anonymity. And so there was the possibility in that specific case of identifying yourself as a think tank or an expert or university. The idea being that we try to select the respondents so that we wouldn't have pure academics, but also if we had academics, that would be academics that basically participate somehow, like, for example, in an advisory capability in the process of basically decision making. And as I said, we plan on running a separate sort of survey with the academics. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, so we move to the third. Okay, Friedrich passes. So we have a few questions online. I first would like to ask Ngozi to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great presentation. I've already sent my questions online, but it's okay. I am Dr. Ngozi Uzoma from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. I'm the principal investigator for the GAPS Return Migration Project here in Nigeria. So I just want to know the criteria for choosing those African countries, especially Nigeria, and also for choosing the 900 and 1,800 euro benchmarks. You know, during when I was participating in the survey, I discovered a question that was problematic to me, like involvement, and I sent later to an email to Carlota about clearing me of if the participation, if what it means, the involvement means participation or interest. I just want to know if other people had some problems also with answering your questions, and when you are framing your questions, do you also have some problems, some issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to sort of meet you again after. Thank you for taking the survey. So in terms of the criteria for African countries, I'll start with the academic sort of methodological sort of sound reasons, which are that we try to find, so we try to select 4 African countries. We could have selected others that had some a specific, a big amount of migration flows directed to Europe. So Tunisia and Morocco being obviously very prominent cases, also were selected as sort of primary countries for talent partnership negotiations. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have research partners specifically that work in this consortium in Nigeria and Kenya that could have also conducted the research in other sort of countries, like adjacent countries, not necessarily these two, but Nigeria is a country that's prominently featured in analysis of migration flows to Europe, but also to the United Kingdom. Kenya, for us, was a bit of an outlying case in the sense that the majority of their flows are not directed to Europe. But for us, it was interesting because they were negotiating a labor agreement with Germany and at the time. And the fact that the majority of the flows were directly either to other African country or the Gulf allow us then to compare the results that we were getting with the results for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa to see if there was something that was specific to our case selection or it was something that in a sense could be generalized a little bit further. And then in terms of involvement, yes, I remember that question. No, I haven't received that question by anybody else. I don't think I don't think I received any other questions in terms of how we formulated the question specifically in the survey. But in that specific case here, I remember that we spoke about involvement, which we meant actual participation in the policymaking process at any stage. And I guess that, especially if you're more on the research side, involvement might also refer to simply studying specific issues and specific policies rather than actually participating in it. No, you were the only one who picked up on that, but thank you for it. We unfortunately the survey was already online, so we couldn't change it, but thank you.
There are two more comments, I think, or questions in the chat. And one of them, Carlota, is asking about the availability of the data after the project has finished. Maybe you could say something about this very quickly, and then we move to the next one.
Okay, so the paper will be uploaded once we close the survey and we conduct the analysis again on the Dynamic website as a working paper. You can find it at dynamicwithY.org. And so you will have access to, you can also find our pre-analysis plan as is online on OSF. In terms of the actual raw data, it will be stored by the Center for the Study of International, the World Economy in Kiel. I don't think it will be open source, specifically the raw data, but I think it would be possible perhaps to contact us if you're interested to basically access for future research. The data in any case, it's all anonymized and it will be coded. So.
Great, thank you. I'll read the following question, and it says, I wonder whether a differentiation has been made between immigration and emigration. It seems for European elites, the answers relate to reasons of immigration, whilst for African elites, it is emigration. I wonder if a differentiation is visible there.
Okay, so it's... So in the setup of the survey, and thinking about the design of the survey, if you go to the...
Nope.
Okay. Okay. I think here you have the... We move the participant. Okay, we move this too. To the side. So if you look at how we sort of formulated the scenario, specifically the hypothetical scenario, it is true that we ask African respondents to think about an individual citizen from this hypothetical African country, or actually for African respondents from the 4 case studies we selected, we asked to think about a citizen from their own country, because this way we can compare directly with potential migrants from their whole country when we have the results of the migrant survey. That wants to migrate to Europe. So we think about immigration. And then when we think about European respondents, we think about it in terms of immigration. It should also be said that if you recall the table where we ask about, for example, the frames, we do specify that when we think about origin countries, they are countries of origins or transit. And this is something because in the initial sort of stages of designing the survey, we sort of circulated the survey across policymaker stakeholders in Europe and in Africa to get feedback on how we were formulating the questions and what we were likely to pick up, if there was anything we needed to be aware of. And African stakeholders pointed out to us that rightly so, we shouldn't be thinking about their countries only in terms of source countries, but also in terms of transit countries, especially. And all of the countries that, in a sense, we study specifically are in and of themselves transit countries. So the same kind of dynamics that Europeans are thinking about in terms of their countries then applied also to these African countries. And some are not just transit, but certain, countries that they become countries of actual destination, because there is a component of migration between Africa and Europe, but also intra-Africa migration. So it's true that in the way we formulated the survey, there is this distinction between immigration and emigration, but it's also in the broader questionnaire, this distinction is actually more nuanced and allows individuals to actually think about their own countries or their own situation in different ways, depending on the specificity of the local situation.
Thank you very much. Claire, is it right? Yes, Claire, please.
Okay. Carlota, thanks so much for the presentation. I know how hard you've been working to get people to respond to the survey. So well done. My question was a little bit about the theoretical framework. So I wondered why you had a preference for using the term positionality as opposed to just actor identity. What you felt that added? Do you think it breaks something down? Do you think actor identity is larger? And then sort of to that point, you talk about positionality and then you break it up into where, which, and who. And I think in terms of actor identity based on the kind of constructivist literature as well. So I think it's who you are always determines how you think. So in a way, when you've got your three expectations, I wondered, is it valuable to have the direct and indirect effect? Or does it just overcomplicate things? And could you just actually have one expectation, which is all about actor identity, because who we are determines the frame that we have, determines the response. And, or does it not help in the analysis, in the analytics of breaking it all down? I just wondered why you went for the kind of more complex approach, and do you think it really adds value? And then in terms of actor identity, I kind of wondered, similar to the question over here, in terms of the political environment, what are the other environmental factors that impact? So you talk about, the role of people in different organizations. So is there something we can borrow there from the kind of sociological institutionalist literature around norms within institutions, so institutionally based, and how that impacts on identity and choices and policy? I also wondered about the media. So just in the same way that kind of maybe a liberal and political environment might create certain ideas, what role does the media have in terms of the narratives around migration in the countries where people are being interviewed? And then I also wondered about the comparison with Europe collectively and Africa collectively. And I wondered, because we don't know from your presentation how many survey responses you had in the different European countries. And I'm just thinking, I know you had quite a good response in Ireland. I think of Irish policymakers who I know well. And, in a country like Ireland, where there's such a recent history of immigration, still, do you get differences and do you see differences across European countries with these strong histories of immigration and how they might respond or don't respond to the questions relative to other European nationals?
Thank you. So a lot of questions. So in terms of actor identity, why didn't I just use the word identity? So why didn't I just use identity as a collective? Well, I would have said identities in any case. And then I thought that the concept of positionality actually allowed me to, rather than speaking about multiple identities, encompassing this sort of intersection between the identity aspect, which is in a sense brought by the process of socialization across different social environments. And so it's where they are from the function of who they become because of who they are, where they are located, that allows that basically builds the way of framing and thinking, and then ultimately the way they interpret. So that's why I use positionality rather than just using identity per se as a concept. But I guess we could debate whether that was the easiest way of sort of conceptualizing it. In terms of having multiple effects, it's true that we could have just simply said, okay, the identity drives the process, but it's also true that it has been shown, so in the way of building, sort of the process of building a theoretical framework, obviously we referred back to what was existing in terms of analyzing migration decision-making in previous literature. And it seemed that it wasn't just who the actor was that influenced how they thought about it, but actually had bearing on a certain way of thinking and approaching, or a certain heuristics about what migration is as a problem, as a phenomenon. And so there was qualitative evidence that frames mattered and that the framing process is actually where at play, but we didn't have any quantitative sort of systematic evidence about this. So we wanted to test whether frames had or did not play a role in this particular process, because from existing literature, what we could see was that, qualitatively speaking, in comparative perspective, had been shown, for example, that you could say that certain pull or pull dynamics mostly, or a pull frame, if you want to conceptualize it that way, was applied by, for example, I'm thinking about Leila Adouch's studies on the US administration and the European Union, and the way they, for example, representative at DHS conceptualize why migration happened towards the United States. But we didn't have any way of, it hadn't been tested systematically yet. So because it was there, we wanted to see whether that effect was present, or if it was simply a matter of going from however you define the identities of the actor to sort of their way of thinking about migration. And we found both effects, although, as I said, the sample size is what it is because of the difficulty in conducting research with elites. So for W2, if you read the paper, there's an extensive part that thinks and looks at organizational cultures, but also the role of norms, values, expectations, and how they impact the identity of the actor, standard operating procedures, and so on and so forth. Obviously, how that gets translated into quantitative sort of analysis with the proxy variable, etc., it's a little bit diminishing it. And so we're bringing that back into the sort of textual analysis and the interview part, because it allows us to, in a sense, in line perhaps with what you were saying about liberal values or sort of in a country, or it allows us to actually parse through this dynamic in a little bit more in depth that we cannot do with a survey. Also, we couldn't say more than, this is your department and this is where you work, because we were advised against, again, putting ideological or these kind of questions into the analysis, because it would have led to officials responding even less than they actually did. Role of the media. So we included the media just for the sake of knowledge formation sources, and it didn't seem to be very prominent in terms of being considered reliable sources of information specifically. And so far in the interviews I've conducted, it has come up in a sense of misinformation of migrants or lack of information. So there is a perception that migrants are not informed or correctly informed on the part of the officials I have spoken to, and this is considered to be a problem in terms of then influencing their decision making, for example, in terms of making a crossing in a difficult situation where they risk their lives, or whether there are enhanced border controls or the impossibility of choosing final destination because of reforms to the European asylum system. And then differences across European countries. So I don't think it's possible so far so I remember I went through every single entry, so looking at the answers also from respondents from Ireland. We're very grateful to the Irish contingent. I don't think it's possible to derive any meaningful distinction so far in terms of the numbers we have. It might be that we will be able to do some meaningful statistically significant, so derive some statistical significant finding in the future, apart from obviously qualitative, maybe differences that can come up in the interview. So we're not able at present with the numbers we have to do that kind of analysis. But thank you, that's an interesting idea.
We are almost at the end. We saw that Christina had posted something, and maybe you can quickly comment on this study on members of the European Parliament.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you because I hadn't seen that actually, and I will go, we'll go look it up. It's very interesting, so I'll make sure to include it for the final sort of version of the paper before we upload it on the website. Thank you.
Okay, here in the room, no further questions, and I believe also online, no further questions. So I want to thank again Carlota for presenting today. Thank you for your participation here and online. We wish you a good day and see you next time around for our MPC seminar.
Thank you so much.